This is section 2 of our first review unit, multiplying and dividing positive and negative numbers. So our learning goal for today is that students will understand how to multiply and divide real numbers. So we're going to look at a lot of different examples today. Alright, first let's start with the properties of multiplication. There's a lot of different properties that you need to know about, and probably most of them are familiar to you. But let's review them and get them in your notes anyway. Okay, so the first property, A times B equals B times A. This says it doesn't matter what order you multiply things in, you're still going to be equal. So for example, 3 times 4 is equal to 4 times 3. The second property, 1 times A equals A. In other words, 1 times any number is itself. We're actually going to use that property quite a bit in algebra, but it's going to take on a few different forms. 0 times A is 0. Of course, that means 0 times anything is 0. And now let's focus specifically on these last three. These last three are going to help us work with multiplying and dividing our positive and negative numbers. So the first one says, if you have negative 1 times a number A, then that's going to be negative A, or the opposite of A. The next one, number 5, if you have A times negative B, well, you're still going to multiply A and B together, but then the value will be the opposite of that product. Another way of saying this is that a positive, if it's going to let me write a positive here. Let's try that. A positive times a negative is a negative. Alright, the next property says if you have the negative A times negative B, that's going to be positive AB. Excuse me. Okay, so that just tells us that a negative times a negative is always a positive. Fantastic. Let's do some examples. Okay, so our first example, I want you to look at this a couple different ways. If we have negative 4 times negative 5, one way of visualizing that is since we have a negative here, we know we have a negative times a positive, so the value at the end will be negative. So that's like saying negative 4 times 5, and of course 4 times 5 is 20, so my final value will be negative 20. So a negative times a positive is a negative. Here's another example. If we have 6 times negative x, a lot of times when we have something like negative x, remember there's really a coefficient there, and that coefficient is negative 1. So that negative x is really like negative 1 times x. So then we can do 6 times negative 1, which we know is negative 6, and then multiply that by x. Alright, here's another example with a fraction. We have negative 1/4 times negative 4. Here we have a negative times a negative, so we know our final result will be positive. So that's just like multiplying together 1/4 times 4. And 1/4 times 4 is positive 1. One more example here with another fraction. Let's say we had negative 2/5 times negative 3/4. When multiplying fractions together like this, first look at the signs. We have a negative times a negative, so we know that my result will be positive when we're finished. And when you multiply fractions, multiply straight across the top and then straight across the bottom. So 2 times 3 is 6, 5 times 4 is 20. Now let's look at these two numbers, 6 and 20. They both are divisible by 2, so when we reduce this, we want our final answer to be the reduced form of the fraction, and that would be 3/10. Okay? Easy. Alright, what if you have 3 or more factors? So when we're doing multiplication and division, we'll talk more about order of operations in the next unit, but when we're doing multiplication and division, we always do it from left to right in order. So first we're going to multiply the first two things together. Negative 4 times negative 2. Right, when we know a negative times a negative is positive, so negative 4 times negative 2 is positive 8. And so now we have to take positive 8 and multiply that by negative x. We know that a positive times a negative is negative, so my final answer will be negative 8x. Now notice we had 1, 2, 3 negative factors, 3 negative numbers we were multiplying together, and my final answer was negative. Let's see what happens in the next case and see if we can find a pattern. So we have negative 3 times 5 times negative y. Again, multiply the first two numbers together first. Negative 3 times 5 is a negative times a positive, which is negative. And 3 times 5 is 15. So we have negative 15 times negative y. Now we have a negative times a negative. So my final answer is positive, and it would be positive 15 times y, or 15y. Now notice, in this case we had 1, 2 negative factors, and my answer was positive. So there's a little rule of thumb you can say. If you have an odd number of negative factors, or an odd number of things that you're multiplying together, that's what a factor is. If you have an odd number of negative factors, then your result is going to be negative. Remember, if it's written on the screen, it's written in your notes. So make a little note on the side. If you have an even number of factors, like we do here, then the result is going to be positive, because you're going to end up with a negative times a negative, which is positive. Fantastic. All right, let's talk about dividing. The first division rule that I want to talk about is one that we're going to use at the end, I think, a little bit. But this one, it's like, how do you turn division into multiplication? Well, dividing by a number is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. That's going to be really, really handy when we work with fractions, especially if we have to divide by a fraction. So remember that dividing by 2 is the same as multiplying by 1/2. Dividing by 3 is the same as multiplying by 1/3. And any expression that we have with a fraction in it, a lot of times instead of dividing, we want to multiply, because multiplying fractions is much easier than dividing. So now let's look at a few rules, or a few of the properties of division. Of course, dividing by 1 is going to keep the same value of the number. We know that, right? Dividing by 0. What about dividing by 0? Okay, so this is like the situation. How do you remember 0 divided by a number is 0? We should maybe add that one in here. That's like saying you don't have any cookies and you have 12 people. How many cookies does each person get? None. But if you switch that around and say you have 12 cookies and 0 people, how do you divide 12 cookies amongst 0 people? You really can't. There's no way to divide them up because there's no people to give them to. So dividing by 0 is, we'll put a big frowny face here. We can't do that. It has no value. So no dividing by 0. Dividing by -1 finds the opposite of a number. So a divided by -1 would be negative a. So another way of saying this is a positive divided by a negative is negative. And again here we have a divided by -b gives us negative a divided by b. And again, that's the same way as saying a positive divided by a negative is negative. But what if we have two negatives? If we have negative a divided by negative b, then my result is going to be positive a divided by b. So that's like saying a negative divided by a negative is positive. So let's do a couple examples. All right, what if we had 10 divided by -2? So we can see we have a positive divided by a negative, so we know my result will be negative. And it'll be -10 divided by 2. And 10 divided by 2 is 5. Of course, my result is -5. What if we had -x divided by -6? Not much we can do here except for we know that a negative divided by a negative is positive. So my result will be positive x divided by 6. So in the next few examples, I wanted to focus on what to do with a fraction and how do we express division as multiplication. So here you can see we're dividing by 1/3. We're dividing by that fraction, right? So the first thing that we want to do is express this as multiplication. So division is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So what's the reciprocal of negative 1/3? Negative 3 over 1, right? Well, don't let that fraction confuse you. That's just 3. So now my problem is really 3 times negative 3. A positive times a negative is negative. So my result is negative 9. Let's look at the next example. We have negative 1 divided by 3/4. So we'll start with negative 1. We're going to multiply by the reciprocal, 4 over 3. And we know that negative 1 times any number is just the opposite of that number. So my final result will just be negative 4/3. Make sure you get that negative in there. Negative 4/3. All right, one final example. What if we have negative 2/3 negative 2/3 divided by negative 7/12? Again, we have a negative divided by a negative. So we know that my final result will be positive. Now let's just rewrite the problem in simpler terms. We have negative 2/3 times the reciprocal, so that will be 12 over 7. So I'm going to show you this two ways. First, we're just going to multiply. Multiply across the top. 2 times 12 is 24. Multiply across the bottom. 3 times 7 is 21. And now let's reduce. Both 24 and 21 are divisible by 3. 24 divided by 3 is 8. 21 divided by 3 is 7. So 8/7 is my final answer. Now when working with fractions, I often find it's easier to do some of that reducing before we do the multiplying. So let me show you how I would do that. Look at factors on the top and bottom. So for example, 2 and 7. They don't have any common factors, so we're going to leave those alone. But 3 and 12 have a common factor of 3. So 3 divided by 3 is 1. 12 divided by 3 is 4. Now we do the multiplication. 2 times 4 is 8. 1 times 7 is 7. And of course we get the same result there. Okay, good job. So now what I want you to do is go back and enter in all the questions on the left-hand column. We're going to compare those when we come to class. And if you're confused, you're not sure what's a good question, let me know. Remember, just a quick reminder, when you're doing your questions on the left, anytime you see an example, that example goes on the left. So real easy ones that you can fill in would be this. Then of course the work is right here and the answer is right there. So do your questions on the left and complete your summary, and that'll be it.